Hi, my name's Bob Greenyer, and I'm a volunteer with the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project. So welcome this January 2024 to Intrigue. How is everybody? Can they hear me out there? Artifact, Gordon Doherty, Tony Yamoni, Louis Navarro, DIY Projects with Chausis, Per Nicola Hoagland, Lithnick, Cookie Culture, WP for Truth, Richard Mueller, Ken Pratt, EBB, D2105K. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Disarray. Dan Moretti, Nick Knock. How is everyone? How are you, Sentient Code and Mr. Gate Mode? Are you well tonight? Sky's the limit. Lucas, Crypto Alchemist. And Bo Grizzly. Cosmic Dave. Yes, excellent. Okay, so you can hear me. So, Intrigue. What you are looking at on the screen there is a photograph of a very beautiful jade object that I had the pleasure of witnessing in the Palace Museum in Taipei, in Taiwan. And I think it's about maybe 500-600 years old. Maybe only 400, somewhere between 400 and 600 years old. It's made from this very hard substance called jade. Now, some might recognize it from movies, that kind of thing. Some might recognize it as some representations of Ezekiel's wheel. But in fact, this is a jade tri-ring, and it is symbolizing heaven, earth, and humanity. That is the label from the museum. It's from the late Ming to early Qing dynasty. And I don't know if you can see it, but it has a vortex feeding into a counter vortex, a vortex pair, a vortex feeding into a counter vortex, and this is all the way around each of the rings. Okay, only on the outside of each of the rings. So someone knew what they were doing. What? Well, heaven you could call space. Earth, obviously, we could call Earth, and humanity we could call human. And that would give us our space, Earth, human. Our space, our Earth, and our human nested existence. This is the New Views on Science book by Dr. Alexander Parkhomov of the Russian Academy of Sciences. But we're not going to be talking specifically about that book today. We're going to be talking about Robert Temple's book, A New Science of Heaven. How the science of plasma will transform humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. So, of course, my view on the wheel within the wheel within the wheel, and the subject of much of this book, which are plasmoids, or plasma as a material substance. The actual organizing structure is a wheel within a wheel within a wheel, and that's the basic level you need to do a XYZ fractal torus. And this is my view on what the wheel within a wheel would be. But of course, this produces a coherent spherical type structure around it. It looks spherical, but typically it is a spindle torus with a Vesica Pisces spindle in the center. And so from the outside, when it would be highly energized, it would appear as a sphere. At other times, you might be able to peer in and see the substructure. But anyway, What the book is referring to mostly is a thing called the Kordylewski clouds. And this is an image from NASA of the Lagrangian points around our Earth-Moon system. And these so-called Kordylewski clouds, or ghost moons as they're sometimes called, are at the L4 and L4-5 positions of the Lagrangian points. And you can see that they are essentially the same kind of distance centered away as is the center of the moon. And more recently, they've been determined to be around about 9 times wider than the Earth. And essentially, Robert Temple's hypothesis in the book essentially is that these Kordylewski clouds are intelligent, as would be all dusty plasma clouds. Why does he say that? Why does he say that? He says that because these dust particles, which are in the low nanometer range, are highly charged, be that net positive or net negative, and they can interchange information and store information via arrangement, and whilst he argues there's no such thing as fields, some interplay of electric forces between these things. And he argues that, in fact, that most matter in the universe is in the form of plasma rather than neutral baryonic matter. That is to say, it's either free electrons, electron clusters, or ionized atoms. Now, one thing I did find interesting early on in this book was that he had referenced a couple of authors, and in fact, much of the book is citing many different authors. In fact, it's almost like one long bibliography. The book sounds like a bibliography if you listen to it. So each point he's making by walking through his understanding of the history of how something was discovered from the earliest point in his understanding, and then taking it forward from that point with all of the people that either said no or yes, or fine-tuned the understanding as it went forward. Anyway, I can't remember the particular names, but there was someone that argued that much of the interstellar dust, in fact, is carbon. And I think it turns out to be much of it is actually carbon, or has a carbon constituent. And that these particles are then charged, and then they have this overall relationship, and they form this cosmic web. And I found that interesting from the point of view that actually carbon isn't that common on Earth. However, what we do see, and what is found by Yul Brown and by our good friend, sadly departed, Takaaki Matsumoto, and by other authors such as S.V. Adamenko, that much of the material synthesized by what I believe are ball lightning-like structures, of which plasmoids in their extreme are, in my view, it synthesizes often carbon from whatever goes in. Now, you know, obviously out there in the big cosmos, most of it isn't heavy metals, heavy elements and ions of those. It's much lighter. And so one of the hard stops with nuclear synthesis is carbon. You know, you've got the stop to alpha particles, helium, and then you have this stop to carbon and then oxygen. And so this hard stop at carbon, it's not surprising then to me that if we had a universe that was built using exotic vacuum objects, then it stands to reason that a large proportion of the interstellar dust would in fact be carbon. And this supports the observations of these low energy nuclear reaction researchers over these many years, that carbon is something that gets readily synthesized, particularly where you have a lot of material that is on balanced light elements. So for instance, in water, where you have, yes, you have oxygen, but you also have an abundance of hydrogen. And so if you're going to find something that's somewhere between hydrogen and oxygen, then, well, that would be carbon, wouldn't it? So why not? If you're starting with things that are like carbon and oxygen and nitrogen as your predominant feedstocks, and there's a little bit of hydrogen in there, well, then possibly you might find yourself producing more nitrogen and more oxygen because the majority of the atoms in the mix that are going into the plasmoids are already at carbon above. And in fact, one person we will mention later on, Leclerc, who did cavitation work, he claimed that if you get over, I think, 55% carbon, it then starts synthesizing heavier elements. So let's say you had a thunderstorm generator and the majority of nuclei going into the thunderstorm generator were carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. Maybe it would stand to reason that some of the elements that would come out would be, in fact, nitrogen and oxygen. And that is something we are going to be investigating. We are going to be sending some of the scraped material from the inside of the outside of the 8-year but run for 500 hours 24-inch sphere to a beamline, and it turns out that we can be looking also for carbon 13 as well as carbon 14. So we could see if there is some progression from carbon 12 to a non-natural isotopic ratio of carbon 13. And also we might be able to see a ratio of nitrogen 15 on this beamline over nitrogen 14. And if that's the case, then that would also suggest that there was some fusion-like processes going on. Now, if we find a very large abundance of carbon 14 in a system that really shouldn't have any of any great note because we are supposedly using fossil fuels, then we shouldn't, if we see a lot of carbon 14, then we've got to think maybe something interesting is going on. So that is kind of the thinking that I'm putting across there in respect of this. Now, he also talked about how these things can be linking together, these Birkeland currents or something similar, which he refers to them as being superconducting structures, such that if they have their intelligence, they can share it like a neural network. And we've all seen these images that, I shared one where the mycelia in mushrooms looks like the brain, and others have shared, and in fact in his book he shares the fact that the brain neuron map looks very similar to the intergalactic threads. So why not? Are they superconducting? Maybe. Is that how it works? And then he suggests actually in the book that the Kordylewski clouds, or possibly their connection with the wider dusty plasma in the universe, may actually constitute the Akashic record. I don't agree. Of course I wouldn't. I think they can play a role. They might store things locally, like maybe they are local storage. But I believe that for a true Akashic record, which is accessible instantaneously across the entire universe, then it requires, in my view, a coherent condensate of something. And I argue that that is relic neutrinos. He does discuss neutrinos. He discusses the neutrino emission problem from the sun, but there's no discussion in the book about relic neutrinos and their potential place in what may or may not be going on. So from my point of view, the relic neutrino is a condensate. It's all at the same temperature. It is a model of gravity, potentially, and it is the great balancer, according to Shishkin, of they call them background neutrinos, of being able to keep all the atoms in a stable state by giving them more energy for the electrons to orbit where they should be, or maintaining their stability by taking a little bit of energy out of an atom and keeping everything at stability. but through their own toroidal moment and the toroidal moments that are in the brain, for instance, which we'll have a quick look at later. That, in my view, is how information is put into and retrieved from the Akashic record. Now, he does in there have some diagrams about on the brain how. Let me see if I can pull up the name of the individuals that he referred to. There was some research done a long time ago. This is a long time before the work that I have referred to, much more recently, about the work at Sydney Technical University, where they looked at the magnetic fields around the brain. And I think it's from work done in 1963 by Gerhard M. Baule, that's B-A-U-L-E, and Richard McAfee, or McPhee, Richard McPhee. And in that work, they observed that the magnetic field on the brain goes from the left to the right. So from the left side of the brain to the right, left side of the brain to the right, left side of the brain to the right. They also determined in 1963 that there were subzones in the brain where there was also a magnetic loop going from one point in the brain to another. Smaller subzones even on one side of the brain. And that would be consistent with the finding by the Technical University in Sydney using functional magnetic resonance imaging, which I talked about in my ICCF 25 presentation as an explanation for why I felt a bit weird with the kind of Lena experiments, where you had this functional resonance magnetic imaging going on, and you had a vortex one way and a vortex the other. These are magnetic vortices, okay? And effectively, this would be creating a toroidal moment, and therefore that would be the means of both data storage and retrieval into the Akashic record. So he doesn't discuss this because, I have developed that thinking. It's not his thinking. And I really would like to meet him and sit down with him. He claims to have at least spoken to or been in the presence of at least 80 Nobel laureates. That is some achievement. Of course, he's been with some of my heroes, like Paul Dirac, if I was to say I had a hero, and that is something really rather special. But of course, I got to this because of understanding from Harold Puthoff at the end of his work on the psychic spy program and his development of this clearly toroidal moment communication technology. And actually, the work of Robert Temple refers to Ninel Kulagina briefly and other psychic spy, specifically the psychic spy program in the Soviet Union. And one thing I wanted to give him was a copy of Space Earth Human, because of course the fourth chapter in the Space Earth Human book is actually the early work of Alexander Parkhomov, and he calls it, what does he call it? He calls it where physics is powerless, and this is his work on the Soviet psychic spy program. And actually some of the techniques he developed during that psychic spy program he used in developing his understanding of the relic neutrino flux from the cosmos. Now, those are the main thrust of the book, is that we are like a late form of intelligence, where the most of the intelligence in the universe is actually in these dusty plasma clouds, which plasma he's arguing constitutes 99% of the universe matter. And so it's not an unreasonable assumption to make or conclusion to make. He makes it several times, let's put it that way. And he builds the argument, and he talks about religious concepts of these kind of things. But one of the things that he spends quite a bit of time focusing on is our good friend ball lightning. And he talks about how ball lightning's original name in the literature was thunderbolts. And of course, we have referred in many presentations to thunderbolts of Prerun and the symbols that they used to ward off these thunderbolts from their buildings, which actually turn out to be exactly the model of ball lightning. That was one of the original O-Day slides. And how thunderbolts were on the pre-Christian Macedonian coinage from several hundred years pre-Christ, and we have shown that they are exactly the derived model from physical experiment of what ball lightning is. Obviously, a thunderbolt is the name of Zeus's weapon, and also the Vajra, and all across the world there is this concept. And so he refers to the fact that ball lightning was originally called thunderbolts, and I happen to agree. He says that these ball lightning gives off a smell of sulfur, and I would agree with that too. We have showed in the cavitation-assisted electrolysis Amasa gas from Dr. Ruishin Amasa, when that was placed on a 10-yen coin, the substructure of a substructure left little micro ball lightnings that seem to eat the oxygen on some copper and convert it into sulfur. Now, he says that the first book he read, in fact, it seems like it's the first book he thinks exists on ball lightning. I think it's 1969, and it was a book by Singer. And Singer's research for that book was supported by the Office of Naval Research. The Office of Naval Research. Okay. Now, another area that he focuses on is monopoles, and he was, as I said, lucky enough to spend an afternoon with Paul Dirac, and these were predicted by Paul Dirac. And a couple of points that he made that I want to explore here. One is that the magnetic something accumulates near surfaces of magnetic poles. And this was claimed by the researcher, I think his name is Koch. And I think also this guy was supported by the US Navy. But actually, Bogdanovich et al. At the Moscow Nuclear Physics Institute has actually shown that. And I'm going to walk you through that work in a minute. So this is where I would like to meet with Robert Temple and, fill in the gaps where he's saying, these haven't been shown or it's been speculated, but there's actually the research being done now. The other one, which I found very annoying, because actually it turns out, although I only read this book this week, it was published in August 2022, I think, the first copy. I don't know whether it... Anyway, the point being that he mentions the noise from monopoles can be magnified by squid. And I actually hypothesized this in my challenges in slide on my practical applications of the fractal toroidal moment. And I argued, essentially because of how Hal Puthoff in his 1993, this is like 9 months after he handed over the Psychic Spy Program to Science Applications International Corporation, the pseudo-CIA cutout, pseudo-private entity that was, all of the Cold War American research looks like it was all shifted in there, so it couldn't ever be attacked by freedom of information requests, so because it's a private company, although it's basically funded by the government. Anyway, 9 months after that was shifted over, as far as I can work out, I might be wrong, but as far as I can work out, he argues that Josephson effect devices, or Josephson effect, can be used to detect the phase shifts from the Aharonov bomb effect that can then be converted into signals that can then be converted into audio for this communication technology using a basic toroidal moment or complex versions of that. And, it's interesting because it was, I think, middle to late last year that Russell Targ, in a YouTube interview, revealed for the first time that Hal Puthoff was US naval intelligence. And that is intriguing. And you'll see this turn up quite a bit in my conversation today. The fact that the Navy, and I've said this for many years, and in fact, when I deliberately looked like I had completely lost it at the beginning of 2017, when I was preparing to reveal my thoughts about Ball Lightning, Ken Shoulders, John Hutchison, and the event, in something that I called Red Pill. And of course, if you want to know why I called it the event, it was because there were several persons that were ready to record the event prior to the first thing interacting with the things that were the subject of the event. And they were arrested and then released back to their home country. And in a news report, they described the fact that they were their mission was to be there to record the event. So that's why I call it the event. Anyway, so I looked into the camera and I said, basically, I know who you are, and you've got just a few years really to come out and be clean and be public about what you know, and I can understand why you've done it and stuff. So it was I channeled all of my acting ability to make a kind of like make myself a fall guy, as it were, to get a few eyes on the situation, because I wanted to attract the attention of these people, and I knew they would know who they were, and partly because they were some of the first people to reach out to the project in late 2013, when we had a thing called Gamma coming out of our repressurization of a Chelani cell that had a leak, and I didn't know these people were who they were until early 2016. So through a sequence of events, but essentially it was an individual, and the people I was referring to was the US Navy. And I find it intriguing that it turns out that the person that encouraged Ken Shoulders to be involved with evaluating the work of John Hutchison, that being Hal Puthoff, turns out to be US naval intelligence. And so I think the US Navy, when I said that I think that they've understood this since the 1950s and 1960s, I think we're going to have another waypoint here, and I have to thank Robert Temple for putting this into his book. I think this is the most important golden nugget in the book. It is confirmation to me that this understanding was established in the mid-1950s. As I said before, I honestly don't know whether I'm cheating, and I'm looking forward to this moment in time through remote viewing to see what I would say and then back propagating. I don't know, but I've been absolutely entirely consistent that was the time that these things were established. But anyway, Hal Puthoff referred to the Josephson junction, and I went and researched devices that had Josephson junctions in them, and one of the first ones that I came across was the superconducting quantum interference devices, SQUIDs. So I'm saying that these can be able to detect these structures, and what is being said by Robert Temple here is that the monopoles, which these things can present as, the noise from them can be magnified by SQUID. Now, noise would be, one could argue, kind of uncontrolled interactions between these things. In the case of Hal Puthoff's device for communication, here, they would be controlled. And so the noise wouldn't be noise, it would be a signal which the squid or other Josephson junction device would be able to interpret. My issue with this kind of thing here is that the brain is working on the same basis, which means extrasensory perception or the ability to mind control or read someone's mind would be able to be developed using exactly the same technology. And more worryingly is, and I've spelt this out, is that your DNA, in my view, defines effectively your cryptographic key for how your brain encodes its fractal toroidal moment messaging. And so armed with someone's DNA, you can individually target, or if you had twins, it would be you and your twin, or it might broadly affect your bloodline. But certainly you could potentially individually target someone's conscious ability and thinking using this kind of technology. And so that is a deep concern of mine, that we are now at that point in humanity where someone that was working on the psychic spy program would develop a device that I would intuit is exactly the type of device that would enable mind control. Okay? So, and I'm absolutely deadly serious about that. I'm not joking. That is exactly what I think, right? And I do not think it's a coincidence that this was developed by someone in that field. Okay, so what happened over the last, where are we now? It's the 28th. Nature scientific reports put a warning out to us that they were going to put a warning on our paper on the 4th of January, the day after it was published. And it's now 24 or 23 days later since I requested some information for them to explain what it was that was the concerns that were raised. And despite quite a few mail interchanges, and despite the COPE guidelines requiring them to let us know what it is that they were alerted to, we have yet to be informed. However, based on the fact that the work of Binzhen Huang and his team is using cavitation, and I'll show some more evidence of this, I kind of had a bit of an epiphany. You know, in my presentation in Poland this year, I actually showed this image here of Crum. Okay? And Crum is a very famous cavitation researcher. And this is the classic re-entrant jet of Crum, his photograph. And I showed that this is essentially the same kind of thing as the toroidal moment. It's the exact same geometry, and it's the exact same as this exploding wire underwater with the same boundary layer. And it dawned on me this week that possibly why the Navy has been so involved in this is because cavitation is something that they spent a lot of time trying to understand. I'm saying that the cavitation is producing exactly the same thing that effectively makes ball lightning work, that makes EVOs work. And by the way, this is exactly what Ken Shoulders said. And Ken Shoulders was brought in by US Naval Intelligence to investigate John Hutchison. And John Hutchison was hanging around naval yards. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of Navy in the Navy going on here. And so it stands to reason that the US Navy would be all over whatever is causing these spherical type structures. And we've already shown in the vibrator plate of Roy Shonamaza, this is just his vibration system, that the hemispheres cut out have these little wings on them that precisely and exactly line up with the cavitation bubble structures done by another third party, and that those two together line up with the structure of the bar galaxy structure, the spiral bar galaxy, and they exactly line up with the structures on the Lion crust, and that these line up with the toroidal geometry, the sacred geometry, which I derived from many hydrodynamic, and I would argue magnetohydrodynamic structures. So I think we have found, in my view, why the Navy was ahead of the game. They had to solve this cavitation. If you look at it, the history of cavitation, if we go and have a look at that now, I've got something somewhere around here on cavitation, have I? There, here we go. So we got this cavitated blade here. And if I go back here, this is just under Wikipedia and on cavitation. And if we go down here, certainly if you read this, you will understand quite a few things that are going on in Binger and Huang's work. And somewhere down here, hydrodynamic cavitation. I think it was in the 1800s that this was first observed. Maybe I could have read that up the top. But anyway, it's early. It happened a long time ago, right, that cavitation first came about. So I was always trying to work out why the army wasn't the people that were most ahead of the game in terms of ball lightning. Why it was so much of an interest to the US Navy. And, you know, I was nearly there mentally when I realized prior to ICCF 25, in fact, a long time prior to that, that cavitation was the same thing. And it was helped by that little birdie in the back of my head, Kenneth Shoulders, saying that cavitation is the same thing. So, yeah, that's kind of where I am with that. Now, in terms of this phrase in the book of Robert Temple here, where he's saying magnetic something accumulates near the surfaces of magnetic poles. Right. To show where that has been demonstrated, so Robert, if you are able to listen to this, I did write to Robert last week and ask if I could meet him in the UK in the coming weeks, and I've not had a reply, which is a shame, but maybe at some point at his leisure he can have a look at what I am saying here. This is from this paper called Experimental Study of Environment ionization in the zone of a periodic discharge in a flow of liquid. So plasma discharge flow liquid. This is where they created lots of ball lightning-like structures. Here, and they're different, you know, luminosity. They've got one here, and they have these luminous filaments here, similar to what would appear to be observed by us in our work for the Vega experiments and also in the thunderstorm generator. Now, in the plasma flow discharge, you are getting mixed poles coming out, mixed monopoles coming out. And they are most likely, and I argued this many moons ago in one of my Azizi presentations, that in this work, you get the north and south and the north and the south coming together because they're mixed poles. And the biggest presented pole is the one that's diffuse rather than the beam that comes out the back. So they're most likely to organize in this fashion when you've got a mixed series of poles here, and that's blown up. And Bogdanovich et al., he actually highlights this as the thing that's important to see on here. Okay? Now, in further work, they used a beamline here to produce high energy electrons, pass them through a conversion target, something like tungsten, and this produces gamma rays and the residual electrons. And this is essentially what the NASA research group are doing, and they are claiming that they are doing a certain type of fusion, but I believe it's actually caused by these magnetoelectrical radiation that are synthesized, the real EVOs that are going on here. And the magnet is here partly to remove the electrons, so they just bend off to one side. But actually what happens is the gamma ray goes through and it interacts with the poles of the magnet as well. Of course, the gamma ray, being a photon, is not affected by the magnetic field, okay? And as we go down here, we can see that in this instance, this is exposed by the gamma ray, so that's kind of like making that fogged. But down here, we see a different situation occurring, and again, this is what I call, and I referred to this before a number of years back, this is showing that on this side, you have singular type poles coming together. And the only way these can organize is if this is a north and this is south and this is north and south, this north has to attach to the south. So they follow each other. Okay? So it's a different type of arrangement to what we saw up here. Okay? And this confirms that they are monopole-like structures. Okay? Now, let's go back to what was said here. He is saying that magnetic something accumulates near the surface of magnetic poles. Well, what is Bogdanovich saying here? At the bottom of this page, he's saying this. When discharged along the surface of the jet, the water jet, a part of the water evaporates, decomposes into components, hydrogen and oxygen, and ionizes, which presumably contributes to the weakening of the monopole bonds, if they are present there. Right, so what they are assuming is that within the water, the monopoles are bound. I believe it's within the oxygen that's dissolved in the water, and I've argued that at great length, basing my original view on the work of Sundaresan and Bockris from early mid-1990s, okay, on the carbon arc experiments underwater, okay? So whatever, they are monopole bonds, and in the normal discharge through water, you're getting both types. They're saying if the monopoles are of the two types, northern and southern, the directions of motions are oncoming. As they accelerate, they build up electrons from the plasma surrounding the main body of the discharge, which contributes to their radial acceleration. If not all, then at least some of these monopoles, with a trail of electrons, presumably from Cooper pairs, penetrate through the envelope onto the surface of photographic paper, where they stop, leaving a trace in the form of birds. Okay, so that's why they're explaining these bird-like structures here. Okay, now in the case of the synchrotron experiment here, where they're going through the conversion target and the magnetics, and they are producing these kind of things, this is specifically what it says. In the case of the synchrotron experiment, it can be assumed that the monopoles were originally located on the magnet's surface, facing the medium plane where the electron beam moves. The halo of the electron beam and a significant part of the Bremsstrahlung photons fall on these surfaces and can initiate the output of monopoles due to the photoelectric effect and secondary emission, especially since the output is facilitated by the magnetic field of the magnet. In the pole gap of the magnet, the air is strongly ionized, which facilitates the accumulation of monopoles with an electron trail. The dispersion of monopoles with a trail is likely to be in the direction of the motion of photons by virtue of the law of the conservation of momentum. So what he is arguing here is that the gamma photons and the Bremsstrahlung photons that are coming along here are forcing the monopoles to travel with it. This is exactly what Shishkin has recently said in laser assisted low-energy nuclear reactions, that the monopoles are gathered from the environment, in this case that are bound to oxygen in the air, and they are then carried with the photons towards the target and resulting in the enhanced low-energy nuclear reactions. This is also facilitated by charging the envelope with the film up to a positive potential due to the emission of photoelectrons and the difference in the range of electrons and positrons when the substance passes after the formation of electron-positron pairs by the beam of Bremsstrahlung photons. The hypothesis for the presence of magnetic charges in the plasma discharge flow area is supported by the formation of pinch discharges, which in their structure are particularly similar to the structure of a monopole with a trail of rotating electrons. A distinctive feature can be the size of length up to 7. Anyway, the point being is that in this Journal of Physics from 2019 paper by Bogdanovich et al. At the Moscow Nuclear Physics Institute, by Buyanov and Nestrovich, they have demonstrated what is claimed by, or supposed by, Robert in his book, A New Science of Heaven, or whatever it is. So there we go. So that's already done. Okay. Now, what else do we have to go through here? Okay. Now, do we have any questions at this point? Because what I'm going to go through next is quite significant. And for me, it pushes the envelope back to exactly the 1950s period that I'm talking about. And I thank Robert Temple for having this little nugget in his book. No, Bob and Ann, this is not a single electric charge, the monopole. This is a topological monopole created by the complex toroidal, fractal toroidal structures. It's not just positive charge or negative charge. That is not what I am saying, Bob and Ann. Not what I am saying. It's a topological monopole. Lithnik asks, I was curious about the event. Is it something you can't talk about? If you want to go and see what I have to say about it, go and see my movie XX Years On. It's on the channel. So Anthony Williams says, has anyone seen the hexagons on Saturn and Jupiter? I'm thinking the sides are the wavelength, a harmonic, or some nuclear magnetic resonance effect. What does everyone think? It's definitely related to the same thing. If you've seen my images of the inside sphere of a Tesla plasma globe, you'll see that exactly the same kind of structures are formed by the self-organization. The plasma pinches, they form kind of like a cellular-like structure from which they gather the electrons that are feeding into the pinch, and this leads it. And so it's kind of similar to how you might imagine the Birkeland currents are, feeding in or feeding out. So Bob and Ann says, you cannot cut away the pole from a magnet. You just create a new magnet if you try. No, it's not that. We're looking at something which is called a toroidal moment. It's not a north or south pole. It's a toroidal moment, and it has a soft pole and a strong pole, and ends up being like a topological monopole. It's a better. The model is a better representation of the predicted and then found topological monopoles at Aalto University in Finland and published in major peer-reviewed journals. And the model that we've derived from physical experiment is a better than their mathematical model that provides their mathematical simulations that reasonably closely match the observed arrangement of the coherent matter in their condensed matter system. AG Radium, yes, it is totally terrifying. It's not just mind reading I'm talking about. It's specifically mind reading your specific mind, and it's specifically manipulating your specific mind, having found out what signals come out of your mind. You can just have some AI learn how your mind thinks and then project into your mind, and because it works through the coherent condensate, in my view, there is no escaping this. You can be on the other side of the universe behind 1 mile of lead. It won't make a jot of difference. The most important thing is to never let any of your family give away samples of their DNA. Okay, so I'm going to get it onto the main thing that I wanted to discuss today, which is pretty awesome. That came out of Robert Temple's book here. And that is to do... Well, okay, there's the Akashic Records here. I'll just show you that. And this is Steiner and Edgar Cayce. They were people that talked about the Akashic Records. And it's a compendium of all universal events, thoughts, words, and emotions. And they claim to tap into those. And you could imagine that Tesla was doing the same thing. And yeah. And Akasha is the Sanskrit word for ether. And there we go. Ether, sky, or atmosphere. All right. So, at one point in his book, and let me just see if I can get the specific moment in that book. Oh, before I do that, I'll just say that he talks about the fact that these kind of plasma things and something that one of the researchers called magnetoelectrical polymers, which might be a cluster of magnetoelectrical structures, might allow for an explanation for something like dowsing. And of course, in Alexander Parkhomov's book, he specifically notes that the interspatial distance between the spines in our vertebrae of humans are correctly aligned to allow it to be an antenna for the relic neutrino condensate. And so that because we know that water with oxygen and metals interact with this stuff, then it's not unreasonable that you could find both by using dowsing. Okay? All right, so for me, the most interesting thing that came out of this book was he was referring to a paper that I had not read that involved Winston Bostick, and possibly the reason I'd not come across it was that he's not the lead author in it. The lead author is E.G. Harris, And second author is R.B. Theus, and Winston Bostic is the number third. He's the third author on this book, this paper, and it is in Physical Review, January the 1st, 1957, and it was received September the 27th, 1956. Now, leading into this, I want to refer to the secrets of Cold War technology, because what was revealed by Robert Temple in this brief part of the book, and can I find the particular part? Yes, so it's in chapter 11 at the 11-minute 50 mark, if you're kind of reading it at a normal pace. And he went through this particular thing, this paper, and it refers to something similar to what I read, which was permeations. And I'll read from page 29 here in this book about Tesla's experience. The sudden quick closure of the switch now brought a penetrating shockwave throughout the laboratory, one which could be felt both as a sharp pressure and as a penetrating electrical irritation, a sting. Face and hands were especially sensitive to the explosive shockwaves, which also produced a curious stinging effect at close range. Tesla believed that the material particles approaching the vapor state were literally thrust out of the wires in all directions. In order to better study these effects, he poised himself behind a glass shield and resumed the study. Despite the shield, both shockwaves and stinging effects were felt by the now mystified Tesla. This anomaly provoked a curiosity of the very deepest kind, for such a thing was never before observed. More powerful and penetrating than the mere electrostatic charging of metals, this phenomenon literally propelled high voltage charge out into the surrounding space, where it was felt as a stinging sensation. The stings lasting for a small fraction of a second, the instant of switch closure. But Tesla believed that these strange effects were a simple effect of ionized shockwaves in the air, rather like a strongly ionized thunderclap. Tesla devised a new series of experiments to measure the shockwave pressure from a greater distance. He required an automatic trip switch. With this properly arranged, a more controlled and repetitious triggering effect was possible. In addition, this arrangement permitted distant observations, which might cast more light on the permeating phenomenon. Shield permeating phenomenon. It's missing an L. Controlling the speed of the high voltage dynamo controlled the voltage. With these components properly adjusted, Tesla was able to walk around his large gallery spaces and make observations. Wishing also to avoid the continuous pressure barrage and its stinging sparks, Tesla shielded himself with several materials. The arrangement of rapidly interrupted high voltage direct currents resulted in the radiation of stinging rays which could be felt at great distances from their super sparking source. In fact, Tesla felt the stings right through the shields. Whatever had been released from the wires during the instant of switch closure successfully penetrated the shields of glass and of copper. It made no difference. The effect permeated each substance as if the shield were not there at all. Here was an electrical effect which communicated directly through space without material connections. He called that radiant electricity. Okay, so I can tell you that MFMP researcher David Butelier, if he's here, that would be great. He is investigating this at the moment. Tesla identified 3 material substances that would not produce the stinging sensations, but did produce these highly penetrating rays. And they were beryllium, magnesium, and aluminium. Aluminium obviously was the most easily affected material by the Hutchison effect. Because it's single isotopic, it's more likely to become coherent, and it's also the thing that Ralph Ring was able to witness turn to jelly and put his hand into, that George eagerly told me a ball lightning contacted an aluminium window frame in Hungary, and for about 20 minutes the passenger in the train was able to manipulate the aluminium frame with his fingers until it set hard. And so there's a lot of evidence relating to ball lightning type research and Tesla work that points to that this kind of metal softening, particularly with aluminium. And Bearden also talks about it. The energetics researchers in 1992 were able to demonstrate being able to turn metal into a moldable form that then could be somehow discharged and then set solid. So, but the point that I'm pulling out there is that the first known example of something going through copper was by Tesla there, but he wasn't witnessing physically what these things were. Now, more recently, we have had other people claim these things. And if I can try and get this in the right order, let me see if I can get this in the right order. So, we have observed going through brass, one of these twisting beams. I'm not going to look for that right now. I'm going to show the comment by, if I can find it. Where is it? Oh, here we go. This is Ken Shoulders in 2010 in the transcript of his meeting with John Hutchison. And he says this: Nancy, well, what about those that have precognition? Or not? That's an argumentative field. I used to work in it. I did a lot of extrasensory perception type stuff. And I just got sick of it, hearing these stories people would tell, who would have no way to back them up at all. And they didn't. I gave up on the field and said that until Hewlett-Packard comes up with a meter saying psychic strength, gesturing the movement of a needle with a pointed hand on an outstretched arm, I'm out of it. Of course, with a squid, we might be able to do that now, okay? But in fact, in Alexander's book, they did literally had needles with a psychic strapped up to them. I'm not joking. They literally did. Maybe I can show you the photo. It's funny. Until they have a needle. And of course, this was here. Look, there we go. Psychic strapped up to a thing that's got a needle on it. Okay. All right. Anyway, I'm out of it. But in this work I'm doing, it's beginning to show me that there's something funny going on here, because I can measure the funniest stuff you would ever want to hear about. I measure the presence, if you will, measured in terms of total accumulated charge or total residual charge of this exotic vacuum object. They vary. Well, nothing varies charge or mass, but these things do. This is so fundamentally opposed to all natural laws, natural meaning man-made, that we have written down that it's outrageous. It's written in the law that says this, said in a parrot-like, monotonous voice. Charge is conserved, mass is conserved, energy is conserved equals mc squared. All hitched together. Wrong. Just dead wrong, because I can take one of these funny little particles and change its charge from actual measurement. This is no hand-waving thing. I can measure it with an instrument. I can do it any day you want to. You can change it over 1 billion to 1, and still have it visible. The heck of it was, I can keep reducing the charge to where it becomes an item that walks right through things. That's how John's earliest work seemed to have things coming from the inside. He had been using a technique similar to what I use of injecting these chargeless particles into a core of material. The use of metal in John's case. He seemed to be fascinated with it. It doesn't much matter. Anything serves as a transport medium, if you will, for these things. Once they get in, they can transform themselves back into an energetic thing just as mean and nasty as can be by increasing the charge. And at that point, they come out mad, and they have. Many of the pictures of John's stuff that I've got that shows phenomena that I never used to understand. How did they get in there? I understood what you do when you sling some of them at the surface of the metal of things. You get an explosive mark. These Evo strike marks are very common, but what wasn't common, or just unknown till then, until later days, was how they could penetrate and get in. Okay, he's not saying in this work that anyone has observed this before. Now, I do know that Winston Bostick was one of his references in his research. Now, it has been observed since. And it is in this work, also by Bogdanovich et al. At the Moscow Nuclear Physics Institute. And this is also with the plasma plasma water flow discharge experiments. Again, they saw black tori, they saw these spinning structures, they saw these filaments, and they say they are monopoles at either end of these filaments, and these are the same kind of thing that I am arguing is going through the thunderstorm generator. But this is where it gets interesting. Firstly, they see recording of long-lived plasma formations, and it's got this 2 days number in here. And as if you recall from the Nevesky and Jverblis work, it was reported to them that the magnetoelectrical structures, the bagel coils, were able to produce an electromagnetic phantom that lasted for 2 days. And you may also remember that in the exploding wires underwater, where ball lightning was formed in the early 2000s work of Leonid Uritskev, he observed north and south variations in iron 57 of the magnetic fine structure under NMR of the iron 57's magnetic moment, either one way or other way compared to the control in another room. And this proved absorption of magnetic monopoles. But in that work, they observed that these structures survived for around about 2 days. Okay? So you have 2 days there, you have 2 days here, okay? And they observed these toroidal plasma objects moving around on the metal, glowing for about 2 days. They also found under video that they saw crystals of these structures. And in the work of Robert, in his book, he also talks that these dusty plasma structures can form crystals. Well, certainly this looks like a crystal to me. However, the really interesting thing for the notion of things going through materials is this. This is figure 9, and it says, separation of a plasmoid part, this bit, from its body, this bit. An object of weaker luminescence is visible on the other side of the plate. Here is the plate. This is the barrier. I think it's a dielectric barrier. Okay? This is the glowing plasmoid structure. And this is the body. What do we mean by the body? Well, if you have your electrons in your charge-separated material, or your charged-separated material, forming into a current structure, and you can imagine that here, at the point that this high-pressure jet of water comes down and goes left and right in a circular, splays out flat on this target material, you're going to get extreme hydrodynamic shear, okay? And we already know from other more recent work that this produces a plasma glow. So we know that there is charge separation going on at the point of this shear. But you've also got discharges going in there. So you've got a much higher electric potential going through this discharged material with this hydrodynamic shear. Remember what I said in Taiwan? the way to create magnetohydrodynamic structures is to have charge separation and multi-axis shear, hydrodynamic shear. So that creates your plasmoid, but the plasmoid itself, I believe, is creating a vacuum current, in the words of David Freiberger, or an electromagnetic phantom, in the words of Zverblis and Nevesky, or Zverblis specifically referring to the classified Soviet energetics research. And what is going through here, through this dielectric barrier, which one might consider is glass, let's say, is the potentially the vacuum current itself, which might be a mirror kind of or a similar type of structure. And Shishkin and Karols, they call it a magnetotoroelectrical radiation. Okay? And when you've got charge structures involved with the magnetotoroelectrical radiation, then you have a magnetotoroelectrical cluster. So when you've separated this, you've separated the charged particles here from the body. This is the magnetotoroelectrical radiation. So what is suggested in my mind by the work of Tesla is that if he went above aluminium, he created dirty etheric rays, dirty clusters. And so there wasn't a total conversion of the matter into magnetotoroelectrical radiation. That is to say that there wasn't enough impulse energy to release the what they actually call this a cluster of relic neutrinos or background neutrinos. You could argue that ball lightning goes through glass because it leaves some of the charged particles behind. It goes through the glass, comes out the other side because all of these structures are neutral, but because they have toroidal moment, they can interact with air and maybe charged particles in the air and rebuild a ball lightning around them. And so, you know, maybe there's a charge differential set up because there's charged particles over here and that isn't here. So it's kind of like it's not completely passing through the glass, all of it, but it kind of reassembles its kind of supporting framework around itself. And so it appears to pass through the glass. Sometimes the ball lightning actually cuts a hole out, a round hole in the glass. But anyway, this is passing through a dielectric material in this case, and Tesla did that with glass, and he also did that with copper, of course. That's a metal material, and he thought that would stop it. Okay, so that is a modern version of, in my view, what Ken Shoulders were doing. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because Robert Temple, in his A New Science of Heaven, refers to a paper by Bostic and two other authors. And those authors were supported by the US Navy. I rest my case. And here is the paper. Okay. This is our paper. And you can see here, it was received September the 27th, 1956. Okay, so I've highlighted a few things in this copy of it here. If it's going to give it to me. Right. Experimental investigations of the motion of plasma projected from a button source across a magnetic field. What are we talking about? We are talking about these types of experiments where he used, and now Robert refers to the fact that this work started in the 1950s. I know it started in 1948. I've discussed that. It was called Project Sherwood, and they were trying to create things to convert the fusion going on in a thermonuclear bomb into domestic fusion. And they had deuterated titanium electrodes and 10,000 amps, extremely short duration pulses, and it would come out and produce a plasma loop, and there would be what's called magnetic reconnection, but Robert doesn't think there's any such thing. But anyway, there we go. That's how it's described. And so this is the basic structure, and then you have multiple of those coming from other sides of the chamber, sometimes over a magnetic field. So that is kind of the thing that we are looking at here, and it's further work from that kind of work that was discussed there. So when the source orientation is such that the force exerted by the magnetic field on the discharge current is in the direction of propagation, the velocity is increased and vice versa. Okay, so there is some effect by having the magnetic field in the direction of propagation of the structure. Okay. Undoubtedly, the simplest method of observing plasmoids is the use of photographic time exposures of their recombination light as they cross the magnetic field. So, what they are saying is when you are seeing a plasmoid, what you are watching is the ionized atoms regaining electrons, and as the electrons fall down the electron shells, you are seeing photons emitted, and that is what you witness as the light, and that light then goes on to the photographic emulsion and produces the trails which I've just shown you. Now, here we go. Work was performed under the auspices of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. On leave of absence from the Naval Research Laboratory, Washington, D.C. Atomic Energy Commission, 1956, right? This is another one of the papers here. Now, who is on leave from the Naval Research Laboratory? Well, that would be these two people with a cross next to their name, E.G. Harris and R.B. Tejas, okay? The U.S. Naval Research Laboratory was all over this. Right. So it's an interesting read. I'll give a link to the paper. This is an interesting finding. The arrival time varies linearly with the separation distance, indicating that once the plasmoid is formed, its front moves with constant velocity across the field. This was an unexpected result, particularly in view of the fact that magnetic field must have varied considerably along the trajectory of the plasmoid. So, you know, the idea is that the magnetic field is stronger close to the magnet, but in the case of what they observed is once it's launched, it was dependent on the current, i.e. the complexity of the charge structure and its intensity was what drove its velocity, but and that was linear, but it didn't accelerate towards the magnet, and so you know that is an interesting finding in itself, but that is not the finding that we are going to be focused on here. The question arose as to whether the velocity of the plasmoid was simply a function of the energy discharged and hence the peak current through the source or not. The velocity is seen to be only a function of the energy discharged and hence of the peak current through the source within the experimental errors. So, this is confirming Tesla's disruptive discharge. Basically, you don't get a decent plasmoid unless you have sufficient intensity of discharge. That is the rate of change, the DI/dt. You just won't get them forming below a certain threshold. Now, in the case of Shishkin et al., they say for hydrogen isotopes, it is 2,000 to 4,000 times easier to create the relevant structures than it is for any element beyond lithium. And what Tesla observed is that beyond aluminium, you just don't get any joy at all. You get dirty etheric matter. You get lots of ions traveling with it. If you want clean structures, you've got to be working with aluminium or below. But much, much easier to work with hydrogen. Of course, they've got hydrogen in these deuterated titanium electrodes, but they've got titanium, haven't they? So that's a problem, okay? The titanium will still produce the dirty material. Okay, but if you've got a pure cavitation system, you could argue that you have just got hydrogen and oxygen in there, or if you've got a discharge in water or a discharge through dry steam, then you've got something that could produce very pure etheric streams. So the disruptive discharge is key. This is why you will see John Hutchison with these very, very large capacitors, or with his own model of the replication of the Tesla disruptive discharge device, which was Tesla's mobile unit. Okay. Blah, 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 blah. This was placed in the beam from the source in such a way that the positively charged part of the plasmoid would hit the upper half of the dipole, and the negatively charged part would hit the lower half. If the direction of the magnetic field was reversed, or if the probe was rotated 180 degrees, the signal was expected to change sign. If the probe was placed parallel to the field, no signal was expected. The probe behaved as was expected. And so you can go and try and understand this a little bit later. It's not the focus of what I'm telling you here, but it's just these probe signals based on the orientation of the probe with respect to the incoming plasmoid. Right, okay. This is the money shot that I'm going to show here. Thank you to Robert Temple for putting this into his book. Miscellaneous experiments. Doesn't sound very important, does it? Doesn't sound very important. We tried to shoot the plasmoid through a small hole in a baffle. This is something that Ken Shoulders talked about, and he said that it was produced the most energetic effect if he had water involved, right? But this is not with water involved. A hole of 0.6, that's 6.5 millimeters, 0.65 of a centimeter diameter, was cut in a copper plate. This was placed in front of the source, with or without a magnetic field. Plasma passed through the hole. This was observed both photographically and with a probe. So, supposedly, this electrical structure passed cleanly through a hole in a copper plate. Just went straight through the hole. This is meant to be charged material. How's that happening? How's that working? With a magnetic field, the stream of plasma stretched out in the direction parallel to the field and perpendicular to its velocity, as was the case in the preceding experiments. Okay, now, this is where it gets very, very interesting indeed. They're going beyond a hole. They're going to use a 2mm mesh. A wire screen with a 2mm mesh was placed in front of the source. The plasmoid passed through the screen. This was observed photographically. Okay, all right. Now, I shared some some photographs that were taken on large format images of work done by Anatoly Klimov during their plasmatron work. This is where they get a magnetron and they create a load of charged particles in a chamber, in a magnetron ionized chamber, and then they have a spark discharge to explode those through a polycarbonate capillary tube. And as it goes through the polycarbonate capillary tube, what do you have? You have charged particles and intense multi-axis shear. And as it comes out, it produced structures that had two vortex structures and two other components. One component that was going one way, one component that was going the other way. What they found was, if they put a mesh in front of it or whatever, it just went straight through. But if they put, I think it was like a negative 2,000 or 3,000 volt, you can go and have a look at it. It's in a video, and I'll share it in the notes for this blog on remoteview.icu. It would go through. It would stop at the mesh if it was charged very intensely in one way. Okay, right. It was thought that since plasmoids scatter one another, perhaps they could be bounced from a copper plate. A copper plate was inclined at an angle to the plasmoid's trajectory and placed in front of the source. Its face was parallel to the magnetic field. Time-integrated photographs revealed that the plasmoids did not bounce from the plate. Both theory and experiments indicate that a plasmoid should be electrically polarized in a direction perpendicular to both its velocity and the magnetic field. It seemed likely that if this field were to be shorted out by a stationary conductor, the plasmoid would be brought to a stop. A copper plate was inserted into the system. It was oriented in such a way that it was perpendicular to the magnetic field. Right? So this is not just here, magnetic field going up like this, plasmoid coming from here and just doesn't get stopped and goes straight through. In this way, it's perpendicular to the magnetic field going up through here, plasmoid launching from over here. What happened? It was oriented in such a way that it was placed perpendicular to the magnetic field. It was placed so that its edge would bisect the plasmoid. That is, you're kind of trying to chop the plasmoid in two. It was placed so the edge would bisect the plasmoid. The results were not those that were anticipated, since time-integrated photographs revealed that the plasmoid completely traversed the region of the copper plate. Boom! There you have it. In 1956, the US Navy, no less, 2 representatives on secondment to the lab there with Winston Bostick, observed exotic vacuum objects as we know them now, or magnetoelectrical radiation passing through a copper plate. Not only that, when the copper plate was arranged so that the exotic vacuum object was coming here and hitting it, it went all the way through the copper plate and came out the other side. Ken Shoulders said that some of the ways he could amplify his exotic vacuum objects was to have one copper electrode with a point, and then that fed into another copper electrode with another point, and then another point, and basically you had a spark gap, then it went into another, and a spark gap, and then it went into another. So it's multiple spark gaps in a row, and it seemed to amplify it. Well, why wouldn't it? Because you've got this etheric matter structure that's traveling through the copper, and it comes to the new point, and it then does more shear on it. And then it comes through the next copper and it goes more shear through it. Okay? This right here, it's just, for me, it's done. It's done. Now, either the US Navy know and have developed from 1956, because what they saw is an electromagnetic projectile going through an entire sheet of metal and coming out the other side. Never mentioned by Ken Shoulders. But he either rediscovered it or was continuing the research. Now, Robert Temple actually discusses, well, this is a bit weird because, like, if you're the US Navy and you're trying to develop, how should we put this, defensive technology, it's no good if you develop a projectile that just goes straight through the metal and comes out the other side, is it? It's not very good, is it? But what if you could stop that? Or, even more interestingly, induce it inside the metal? Here, my friends, I think we are getting to the nub of the Hutchison effect. What do I mean? In Bearden's Fer-de-Lance, and in some of his other books, he goes very clearly into what constitutes a scalar wave production method. Here. Yeah. There. Okay. Right. 180 degrees out of phase electromagnetic wave so that it cancels to zero and it compresses and expands the physical vacuum. I'll read to you now. Okay. Slide 23. Scalar wave production. We now visualize the formation of waves of pure stress in space-time medium in the vacuum. These we call scalar electromagnetic waves, Tesla waves, electrogravitational waves, longitudinal electromagnetic waves, waves of pure potential, electrostatic magnetostatic waves, and zero-vector electromagnetic waves. All these terms are synonymous. Each sheds its own particular light upon the nature of these waves or of their original discoverer, Nikola Tesla. We use a Gedanken experiment or thought experiment in which we can perfect Thus, we have two single-frequency electromagnetic sine waves whose electric field components are shown on the slide, which I showed you at the top. These two waves are of the same frequency, travelling together in the same direction and superposed 180 degrees out of phase with respect to each other. In this case, at any spatial point, the summation of the electro and magnetic fields are vector zeros. However, if we plot the spatio-temporal vacuum stress induced by the wave, we see that it constitutes a sine wave with compressive stress in one half cycle and tensile stress in the second half cycle. Rigorously, this defines a longitudinal electromagnetic wave, or what Tesla called a sound wave in the non-material ether. Also, rigorously, it is a gravitational wave, for it is a wave of the curvature of space-time, non-linearity of vacuum itself. That is, what is changing in the wave is the vacuum stress, or intensity of the virtual particle flux of vacuum. That is identical to changing the curvature of space-time. In one half cycle, the space-time is curved positively. In the second half cycle, space-time is curved negatively. Since the increasing or decreasing of intensity of virtual particle flux vis-a-vis the with respect to the ambient vacuum virtual flux intensity represents electrical charge, then in one half cycle negative charge is represented, and in the other half cycle positive charge is represented. This directly explains the positron-electron pair representation of an electromagnetic photon, the photon being one wavelength. In one half cycle, time moves slower. In the second half cycle, time moves faster. Thus, scalar waves can also be considered tempic waves, to use Wilbur Smith's term, or oscillations of the rate of flow of time itself, about the ambient rate of time flow. Since these oscillations are variations in the curvature of space-time, then they represent gravitational or force-generating waves when coupled to a mass. Variations in the rate of flow of time produce force, just as any other type of curvature in space-time does. Right. What I am arguing that he's got basically a standing wave, but if you made these 180 degrees out of phase system, this scalar wave, not as a standing wave, but as a traveling wave, okay, then you could move things that were located at a particular point in space and time towards a target. Or you could induce stress in a material and synthesize an exotic vacuum object in a particular material. Moreover, if you use interferometry, and that is where you get two scalar wave emitters and you interfere them into a zone, then you get a grid into which you can energize the structures, create these monopole-like structures. And Ken Shoulders, in the conclusion of his book, called an EV, which was his name in 1986-87 for these things, a perfect monopole oscillator. So if you're pushing energy into a system and you're not really worried about the metal, it's not going to affect it. And for instance, if you are, for instance, you could generate you could have a traveling scalar wave pushing it into the metal, and then you could have interference of scalar waves. So you've got the phase conjugation leading to the scalar waves, and then you've got the interferometry leading to locating at nodal points in a regular array. Then you could place these into a metal and then energize them in a metal. And in this way, my friends, I think that it would be impossible for me to think that the US Navy are so stupid that they could not work this out between this experiment published in January the 1st, the first day of 1957, And they could not work out how to stop these structures in metals or generate them within metals before now. It may have been the case that why they were so very, very interested in the work of John Hutchison is that he had been able to seemingly use Tesla's disruptive device to generate these things, or, you know, a xenon bulb but used in spark gap mode, or other discharge devices to produce these structures, or with uranite maybe producing them in the same way that they were being knocked off magnets by the Bogdanovich Moscow Nuclear Physics Institute using a uranite source. All of these different methods for creating these things, guiding them with traveling waves, traveling phase conjugated waves into a sample zone, and then energizing them. Now, if you're energizing them on the surface and they are aggregating and they're building bigger and bigger structures, then at some point, because the structure itself might be half in the surface, it might end up by just plasticizing the outer of the surface. So when his colleague came in and the aluminium bar was glowing very orange or whatever, and he came in shortly after it's turned off, it stopped being orange, and he went to grab it, and he ended up leaving his fingerprints in that particular sample, then that's only working from the outside in. You can imagine that in the smaller, thinner samples that we have, that the clusters could get big enough so that they're even though they're halfway in the surface, they're actually effectively, they're all on both sides until they get so big that they are effectively a fractal of themselves. And so they include the metal in the middle, and then as you've got one building up over here and another one building up here, they may be the same pole, and they end up pushing and twisting themselves around. I think right now, what I have shared with you today, and thank you to Robert Temple for alerting me to this paper, means that Ken Shoulders was either replicating what the US Navy had done, and maybe the US Navy hadn't told Hal Puthoff, who had got Ken Shoulders to look at John Hutchison's work, that this had already been done in 1956, and kept that from him on the hope that maybe Ken Shoulders could work it out independently for himself based on observing what John Hutchison did, or that Ken Shoulders knew this all along, and he wasn't discovering that these things could be made to go through metals. It was already known. It was already known here. But the interesting thing was, how could we make them stop? And then how could we make them energized? How could we synthesize them in the metal directly, like John did, it would appear in certain instances? How could we make them blow up? How could we convert something that just went through metals into something that was useful for defense? I don't know. Now I'm going to come back to what happened within a 2-week period a little while back. And that was a YouTube blogger called Robert Murray Smith, within a couple of weeks, attacked first John Hutchison, or second John Hutchison. It was one of the other way round, and then low-energy nuclear reactions. I asked him first to correct the name of John Hutchison, because he called him John Hutchinson with an N, but that's okay. I made that mistake early on, at which he did. So I'm pretty sure he read my comment. But I challenged him to a live on YouTube debate about John Hutchison. And then when he tried to rubbish low-energy nuclear reactions, I challenged him again. And I didn't get a response either times. But you know what? Someone did respond. And that guy was called Fred Zopfel. Here. June the 22nd, 2022. A few months before Robert Temple released his book. The fact that you give any credence whatsoever to the preposterous claims of Mark Leclerc and Nanospire pretty much discredits your entire argument. I have a copy of Leclerc's LENR results, and they are utter nonsense. His ludicrous claims of producing copious amounts of ionizing radiation in every element in the periodic table from cavitation is simply false. His results are just detritus from the equipment, such as small pieces of leaded brass. Anyone who believes Leclerc's crapola for more than 30 seconds has no credibility. Please note that, and he goes on, 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 and I challenge him back, and he goes on, and he goes on, and he challenges him back. I have never spoken to Fred Zopfel. When I asked Robert Murray Smith to a open and live debate about these two subjects, it was Fred Zopfel that popped up. Well, I had heard his name before. Who was Fred Zopfel? Who was Fred Zopfel? Let me just get this for you. Hopefully I can find it. Yes. So, I'm reading from the Vortex archive from the sadly deceased Bob Cook, Friday the 4th of September 2015 at 8:33 in the morning. Stephen. I don't know whether he's talking to Stephen Crivet, but maybe. Again, I agree with you. I was a nuclear engineer for over 25 years as a government employee with the Navy, with the Navy. So this is a copied message from to Stephen that Bob Cook is copying, and I think it's Fred Zopfel. I think it's Fred. No, it's not. I think it's Bob Cook. Anyway, I'm just going to read the message. Again, I agree with you. I was a nuclear engineer for over 25 years as a government employee with first the Navy and then the Nuclear Regulation Commission, retired in 1988. Fred claims to have worked for the Navy, it seems. It would surprise me if naval researchers do not already have a working LENR prototype power source. Direct electrical energy production would be a natural source of power for a ship, particularly a submarine. My thought about Fred's ranting was that this is what he does. He rants. I'd seen the rants before. This was the first time I was subjected to one of these rants. My thought about Fred's ranting was that he must be a security boy trying to deflect attention from the LENR research and development to sustain its dark applications as dark. I have seen reports of over 5,000 dark secret programs within the US government. The Union of Concerned Scientists, Secrecy Now, was the source. There must be many security types that try to discourage research and development in the dark areas. Think about the Department of Energy on the heels of Pons and Fleischmann's work in 1989 and 1990. The good nuclear engineers will be a big help in LENR research and development given their skills in engineering physics, metallurgy, dynamics and control, heat transfer, thermal hydraulics and shielding design, etc., etc. I think they will adapt readily, paying no attention to the likes of Fred Zopfel. And basically, he wrote this. This is Bob Cook. He wrote this to another LENR researcher at the top of this thread, and he says, I think this is Fred Zopfel. I have a PhD in nuclear engineering, 1983, and almost 40 years of experience in naval and commercial nuclear power. I worked at ADM Rickover staff on naval reactors. Okay, something similar is what he said to me as his credibility. However, what I found out was this. Apparently, maybe it's a different guy. But there was a Fred Zopfel that was nominated to be a member of the US Nuclear Safety Research Review Committee in 1990. His literal job, therefore, would be to monitor any nuclear research that could lead to safety issues. Okay. Now, let's look at someone else that did cavitation research, shall we? And this was someone that was a researcher who we referenced in the work that's just been published in Nature Scientific Reports. And that is one Rusy Telyarkin. Okay? And I have to say, this is on Stephen Krivitz's Lena reference site on New Energy Times, and it's an incredibly detailed, fine piece of work. And this is Telyarkin, and Stephen met him, I think, a number of times. This is one of his photos of Telyarkin. And to cut a long story short, there's this guy called Putterman. Who is Putterman? Well, you can go and find out about Putterman because he has a whole organization, I think. Let me see if I can find it. Yes. It's the ULCA Putterman Research Group. Sonoluminescence sound into light. This device here, you literally drop it 1 inch and it produces a flash of light, right? You don't have to have ultrasonics or whatever. It just produces a flash of light. This one, you shake and it produces a flash of light. They've got all kinds of devices here that they create this sonoluminescence with. And they talk nuclear fusion. Can one achieve the inverse process? Namely, can the energy of a strong sound wave implode a bubble with such force that it can use to make... Rusy Telyarkin claimed he observed nuclear fusion. And it says, Faraday, blah, 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 BBC view... Okay, right. To cut a long story short, the US Navy got involved with Telyarkin. The naval labs, apparently, according to the Bubblegate index here, I think I'm right in saying that they replicated it. Oak Ridge nuclear cavitation confirmation, they uncovered it. This was in 2013, long after he was destroyed. And you've got these characters here, and you can go and look at it, okay, in detail. But the long and the short of it is that it was US naval people that, if I put in here Navy, maybe we'll see it. So, following blah, 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 and their colleagues at the Navy Acquisition and Integrity Office, the Navy imposed additional punishments on Telyarkin. The Navy had decided to prohibit Telyarkin from receiving federal funding. The day after the Navy sent the letter to Telyarkin, Adams told Krivitt that the Navy was not going to issue any blah, blah, blah. Here we go. So basically, they didn't properly replicate it. It was the US UCLA here that received the funding. The funding came from the Navy and the Department of Energy, and it's to this person that you saw on the previous website that I was showing you. And essentially, Krivitt was directed to Mark Wilson, an official with the Navy's Acquisition and Integrity Office. Basically, the Navy stitched him up, and the conclusion is, when he was asked if he would ever do it again, he says, "I, for one, would not put my family through this again, even if funds came begging," Telyarkin wrote. Right? So they basically destroyed Telyarkin. With Leclerc, they invited him to do research at the US Naval Labs. Telyarkin did research at Naval Labs. It's something we were invited to do in 2012-13, and we politely refused because of the terms, the MFMP. It would seem that the modus operandi is see what someone knows and try and divert them. And if diverting them isn't successful, put them in a position where they're dependent on funds that ultimately come from the US Navy or affiliated resources, and then somehow discredit them and pull the plug and make it very difficult for them. I am now appealing to the US Navy to come clean. I asked this without naming you in 2017, in March 2017. You've had 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, nearly 7 years to come clean. Stop stringing everyone along. I know the weapons are probably wonderful. Yeah? Really don't want those out. But what we would like is the freedom to explore the element remediation for things like Fukushima, the element synthesis for elements that are needed, technologically speaking, for energy production, and for waste, other waste and destruction, and for matter manipulation in forms of, cold metal forming and these kind of things. Enough already. Stop the games. You've known for since 1956, okay? Maybe you were, let's say you were stupid, like really, really stupid, and it took you another 10 years, like 1976, okay? 1976. Yeah? I think there are a number of technologies that are held by a number of countries that use this as a principle, and unimaginable amounts of money are used to prevent this from becoming a mainstream. The choice I had to make at the beginning of 2017 was to know that this had been developed in the 1950s and 60s and to walk away from the field because of its weaponization potential, or to accept that the weapons had already been made, which clearly, in my view, they had, and to try and find a way that enough people understood the basis of this and the fact that it had been understood so long ago, and that there are real practical applications of whatever this is. And I believe it is a complex toroidal charge structure which is superconducting. It has a fractal toroidal moment, and it's the fractal toroidal moment that's able to interact with matter in incredible and magical ways. But it is just science. It's not magic. It's just science. John Hutchison, I think we're very close to having a full understanding of how he did what he did. It's just logical. It's logical, all of the actions that took place after he showed what he did. And it's logical in the context of this paper here, which shows that they had observed one of the key properties prior to September the 27th, 1956. Prior. So with that, I will ask if there are any questions. We are genuinely fighting an organization, and just to put it in context, in October 2001, the US Air Force asked for a study to be done, which is on the Black Vault. It's the ball lightning study. And they concluded that there was three methods. One, forget about it. One is Ken Shoulder's exotic vacuum objects, and the other one is a classified research done by the US Air Force in the 1950s and 1960s. What were they doing with ball lightning based technology? Why was it so important to the US Air Force in the 1950s and 60s? And who did that research? None other than Eric W. Davis of Warp Drive Metrics. Now, who is Eric W. Davis? He's a colleague of Harold Puthoff, who is US Naval Intelligence. I rest my case. Okay. I'm going to see if you have any questions. So, Corky's Goss says, question, can you say what you might speak about at the CS 2024 in June? So this is the Cosmic Summit in June. I would actually like to explore a little bit more about the Great Pyramid of Egypt and how that might be rebuilt and what it might do for the Sahara. and potentially for the whole planet. And its relationship to the Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, I think, and its back relationship to obviously the sacred geometry. I think solving those mysteries for the people at that conference in a clear and concise way, which is just logical, it's provable, and it meets with all of this magnetohydrodynamic understanding. I think it would be the best gift that I could give that community. Let's see if that's what I'm allowed to do. So Martin Kemp says, so if I just think about maximizing shear, then I'm on my way. Yeah, basically, when you've got a sphere and you've got plasma coming out of the engine's manifold, and it comes in, it's going around in a vortex this way, which also already means you've got shear that way. Now it's going down the sphere, so it's got shear that way, okay? And it goes both that way and then that way. So it has 3-axis shear in that sphere. The water coming in, which is highly moist, hits the high temperature flue gases and flashes to steam whilst it's traveling around in a multi-axis shear, which, when we know the Armstrong boiler, which I gave in my presentation in Zurich, produced 2-foot-long sparks before there was, like, you know, Van de Graaff generators and Tesla coils, just from flashing steam in an environment where it had high degrees of multi-axis shear coming out of that capillary tube, just like the capillary tube from the HHO gas of Slobodan Stankovic through a carbon capillary tube, or the polycarbonate capillary tube of the plasmatron of Klimov et al., producing the same structures with the 2 vortexes of coherent matter traveling waves. That's what you need. So Gordon Doherty says shear works on the ether level is the key to this technology. Yeah, but what you're using is you're using the charged separated material with the multi-axis shear to create the such structures that then lead to the vacuum current structures, right? So you've got the magnetotoroelectrical radiation, which can be in a neutral state. So you can create a facsimility. It's literally a ghost particle. It's a particle that's made up of neutrals, okay? But the neutrals have a moment that can also interact with electrons. So it's kind of like it can build a pattern of itself around itself. Hi, Curtis. Good afternoon. I did, Curtis. To be honest, I'm not a mathematician. That's not my focus. My focus is on physical. He's asking, did I see his APEC token? Yes, I did. But if you're willing to talk about physical, repeatable experiments that are easy to understand and have a history, for instance, this stuff that I'm talking about here, you know, that we've replicated pretty much everything that Bostic did in terms of the visuals, but we've caught them on cameras in a beautiful way, with the works of Henk Uren and David Butlier here. You can see them here with the various traveling waves and structures coming out of these explosive events, and comparing them to observations by Shoulders. Here, comparing this to observations by Baronoff. Here, and here comparing observations to Claude Dervaux, and this one here is very similar to the ones in the 1950s papers of Winston Bostic, and these ones orbiting around each other. So okay, I'm going to look for any questions. Yeah, Sapphire is still going strong. I spoke to them quite a bit before Christmas on safety from these neutral structures, what the options potentially are. So Chris Adams says, have you ever seen the picture of Monopole? I think you mean Monopoles from the Blue Book. No, I haven't. Sorry, I'd be interested if you can get that to me. Yes, S. Martin. They have stolen this technology, or rather, they are pretending that they've invented it when it's the gift of the universe, and like every tool that the universe can provide, it can be used for good or evil. I couldn't leave this field in 2017 knowing that there was only applications of this tool that would be used to subjugate humanity. And given the fact that they were mastering the electromagnetic mind control aspects of it, humans need to be aware that this is possible, and not possible in a sort of sci-fi Black Mirror type. I've never seen an episode of Black Mirror, but some people tell me there's some of the concepts are in there. But, you know, we need to be on a level. There needs to be enough of us that implicitly understand that this is possible, so we can recognize when it's being used against us. I'm really concerned about the laws coming in just a few days into the European Union that means that they can just deem anything they don't want to be shared not able to be on the internet, as far as I can work it out. And since the European Union is such a huge block, it's effectively going to block a lot of the US material effectively as well. So I don't know. I knew we had little time. I think we actually got more time to do this than even I was expecting. I thought we had about 4 or 5 years to get the understanding out. But the history is a gift that keeps on giving. History is a gift that keeps on giving. You know, these papers are out there that, unfortunately, I mean, this is something that actually Robert Temple says. There were several people that were funded by the US Navy and by other institutions, but it would appear to be predominantly, the US Navy just keeps coming up and up and up, that were funded to do things, and then they kind of like went rogue. They started publishing papers that individually don't tell you much, but collectively they reveal enough of the information to make it, able for you to make reasonable assumptions. What we're at now is, with our experiments, just because we bothered doing them, there was a whole bunch of things that couldn't be explained by, it's just images in clouds, and, you know, these things can't happen, and blah, blah, blah. And you ended up tracing it back. to actual papers that were funded by these institutions. And it's like, okay, that's what's going on. And you kind of see the behavior and why, it's sick, really. It's sick. Okay, I'm going to see if you've got any questions down the bottom. Tiziano Fulcari. What should one read to understand excess heat and nuclear processes in the nickel hydrogen systems in very high vacuum? If you have very high vacuum and hot metal, you tend to get the metal vaporizing. So you need to be careful about that. Certainly, if we had too much vacuum in the Celani cell, we'd end up by creating a lovely copper mirror. So be careful about that. Nickel hydrogen systems, if you have powdered nickel hydrogen systems, they stopped doing that research in Russia because when they had like about half a kilo or a kilo of nickel powder and they had treated it to remove all the oxides or whatever and degas it generally, and then they put in fresh hydrogen, the entire lab would get full with strange radiation. And because Yurzy Bazhatov had likely died from this, they basically had a hard stop on this. So I kind of like systems where they can kind of capture and drain the flux of this stuff. So I'm still a big fan of Suhas Ralkar's system. Unfortunately, greed got the better of him, or rather his son's greed got the better of him. I kind of like, let's see what happens with the thunderstorm generator. My view on the thunderstorm generator is I haven't seen enough to be interested in it. Then I saw these things coming out and I go, okay, all right, now I have to look. And then I predicted it was going to be based on ball lightning and it would have these iron-rich crenellated spheres. And then I looked and found these structures that we had observed and Matsumoto had observed. And I go, now you have to give me the sample. And he doesn't want to. And then he gives me the sample. And then I find the iron-rich crenellated spheres. And it's like, oh, God, now it just... it probably is doing what it says on the tin. Now, what specifically is it doing? Is it making more oxygen? Is it making nitrogen, which I think is possibly the case? And it's taking carbon, 2 hydrogens, making nitrogen, and nitrogen isn't being looked for, and the balance from the water of the 2 hydrogens coming and helping carbon become nitrogen, and some of that is going on to oxygen, but you've got oxygen left over, haven't you? So you get oxygen and some CO2 coming out that doesn't quite make it, depending on the overall system. So we'll see what happens with that. But it's quite unfortunate because every step I take, I think, well, this time it's not going to deliver, and then it delivers. It's like, oh no, now I have to continue. Chris Adams says, I can't believe Bob hasn't seen it. What haven't I seen? So Lithnic says, are you optimistic about Thunderstorm generator reaching mass production? If it does what it says on the tin, which it increasingly looks like it does, I'm extremely optimistic. Basically, the role of the MFMP was to help people, and sometimes you're going to try and help people that don't have something. We tried to help people in the past that actually we found out they didn't have anything. This is what I'm saying about the thunderstorm generator, is it every time I make a prediction, it seems to actually physically have that, and it's based on historical understanding and also our own research, and so it's not a very hard guess to make, and it seems to have it. So let's see what happens. The samples are in this container here, and they will be shipped off to the beamline tomorrow. They say it's going to take 5 to 6 weeks to have the results back. I mean, either a higher abundance of 13 carbon, 14 carbon, or 15 nitrogen, they would be earth-shattering results. They'd just be earth-shattering results. So let's see what happens. And there's a lot more material to look for. If this is pointing in a positive direction, then I'm going to scrape some of the sulfur deposits off and see if there's an abundance of sulfur 34. If there is, that implies production of oxygen 17, which is similar to what is supposedly happening in Binger and Huang's cavitator. And then we have a combined understanding, based on the operation of ball lightning, which is in sync with the ball lightning explosions that we've seen in Vega experiments of Henk Uren, and the ball lightning crenellated ion spheres that we've seen in other cavitation systems like the Ultra experiment, and in electrical discharge systems and plasma carbon in the supernova and nova reactors. Everything's lining up with the observation of physical ball lightning spectra and how it decays, and the fact that nitrogen is going down at the end there, and there's still silicon and nitrogen. 2 nitrogens is silicon, and it's like, okay, all right, so probably it is like this. And a lot of mysteries are going to be solved, but a lot of opportunities are going to happen. But when you've got the US Air Force and the US Navy absolutely obsessed with cavitation and making sure no one's researching it, and if they do research it, that they're discredited. And if you got people that are looking at ball lightning like John Hutchison and making sure that they're discredited in some way, but you're still doing the research, I think that's what it is. So in terms of it coming to fruition, the research is going on, as far as I understand, in India, and that will be massive. I helped Malcolm potentially achieve support at the very, very highest level of probably the most capable funding body on Earth. And if the technology delivers, you can guarantee in that instance that there will be all the money that's necessary to roll this out across the planet. 100%. I think for India, making clean air in the cities is just a huge win. Just totally transformation of hundreds of millions of people's lives. The people in India are the head of the head of the Indian Navy. It's the Navy again, of course it would be, but it's the head of the Indian Navy are behind this. So I said a year or two before they rolled out the sniffles, that was the direction they would go, and then I said that they would then implement a war, and then they would implement chips in people's heads, and those that didn't vote the right way, they'd switch them off. We have to get ahead of this. We have to get ahead of this. We have a window, in my view, between now and it's either 2032 or 2033. It's not long. So, I'm going to do a quick review. This was, my dear friends, Intrigue. Intrigue. Yes. Intrigue. There is a lot of intriguing things, and there is a lot of intrigue. Two ways you can use this word. And this rather beautiful jade structure from the late Ming to early Qing dynasty is symbolizing heaven, earth, and humanity. It has on its outside vortex and anti-vortex, vortex and anti-vortex on the outside of each of the three rings. Heaven could be considered space. And then you've got earth and human, and that is what Alexander Parkhomov named his book in 2009. The book which gave us, for me, the absolute boom, the slam dunk, that this technology was understood, and the reason why a US naval asset asked potentially the only guy that could possibly understand it in the world, Ken Shoulders, to look at the work of John Hutchison, was revealed in this book by Robert Temple. A brief section in this book talking about new science of heaven. And of course, he's talking about toroidal structures, not as in the wheel within a wheel within the wheel on the right there, but the wheel within a wheel within a wheel fractal toroidal structure like this, the complex current superconducting structure. He does mention a lot of times that it's superconducting. And in his book, he refers to the ghost moons, the Kordylewski clouds, which are at the L4 and L5 Lagrangian points, which are about the same distance away as the moon, where there is concentrations of dust, and the dust has charge on it. And he speculates that the dust clouds, both here and through Birkeland currents throughout the cosmos, act as a super intelligence, and that 99% of the universe, the visible universe that we see, is actually plasma of some type. That is not whole neutral atoms, the sort of stuff that we are kind of made on the outside and the things that we sit and use. But even in our body, our cells are actually plasma type structures. A lot of the time there's this constant interchange of ions and electrons within our physiology. So even within us, there's a lot of this going on. And he talks about how that can potentially, the dust clouds can be the Akashic record. I say that I consider that it might be part of it. It's kind of maybe like the local RAM or whatever, but I believe that the Akashic record needs to be one coherent condensate so that information has zero time to transfer. It's available anywhere, all of the time, and can be accessed in unique ways by individuals' own DNA-derived fractal toroidal moment encoding. He spent a lot of time talking about ball lightning in the book, quite rightly calling it its original names of thunderbolts, and I referred to the fact that we have observed thunderbolts on the coins of the Macedonia, sort of Greek peninsula there, prior to Christ, and that they were the correct structure as determined from ball lightning in terms of wheel within wheel within a wheel, and that Jesus certainly understood this and put people back on the right track, and the fact that the Vesica Pisces and the Chi Rho, it's actually Jesus Chi Rho, Jesus Christ. He actually was given that moniker and should be given full credit for putting humanity back on the right track. And God, has it taken too long to understand the importance of the glory that is this simple, beautiful physical thing that runs everything. He notes that it gives off a smell of sulfur, and of course we've actually shown that synthesis in a substructure of a substructure of a substructure, possibly in microball lightning, converting oxygen on copper to sulfur. And he said that his first book he read, or the first book he had on ball lightning, was from 1969 by the author Singer, and Singer's research was supported by the Office of Naval Research. Of course it would be. He talks about monopoles, predicted by the person he met for an afternoon, Paul Dirac, and that magnetic something accumulates near the surfaces of magnetic poles. And I think Koch was also funded by the Navy, but we actually showed that Bogdanovich had actually demonstrated that to be the case. And he also mentioned the noise from monopoles can be magnified by squid, and I hypothesized this in my ICCF 25 presentation based on the fact that the squid was a type of Josephson effect device. And so it's very interesting that I suggested these can be used for detection, and so any serious research at the high level into these areas should probably consider having a squid type device or some other form of Josephson effect device in order to detect activity in their reactors. And he also talked about dowsing and that kind of aspect. Now, it came down to a discussion on and Crumb was in there, and these other characters were all in there, and now they've got research into cavitation and stuff. But it is all the same sacred geometry, and so I made the connection finally that the US Navy probably was interested in this, and maybe I'm giving them too much credit, but clearly we have shown the same structures are at the cause of cavitation. Ken Shoulders specifically said that cavitation is the same process. And of course, I've shown how he's connected to the US Naval Intelligence. And so it's not surprising, but we've literally shown how it is exactly the same thing. This same magnetohydrodynamic structure is formed. Therefore, if ball lightning is proposed by the US Air Force to be a way to do nuclear fusion, then why couldn't the same structure that is the cause of cavitation be a means to do nuclear processes in a safe way, as it appears to do simply in our ultra experiments? But concerningly, the Psychic Spy program led to a technology for communication using the toroidal moment, although it's not referenced, and using effectively coherent matter, quantum detectors, and effectively that is what's going on in the human brain. And I also talked about how in Robert Temple's book, this work from 1963 showed how the magnetic field in the brain goes from the left side to the right side, left side to the right side, left side to the right side, and that within each hemisphere they'd already identified there were magnetic fluxes going from one part of the same side to the other part of the same side, and that is consistent with what has been determined more recently by functional magnetic resonance imaging. So we briefly talked about the work of Tesla determining these structures that could be formed by disruptive discharges, unidirectional discharges, that led to structures that were able to transport over large distances and even travel through metal plates. And that this was also observed in our experiments and also mentioned in the experiments of Kenneth Radford Shoulders. And I showed work here by the Moscow Nuclear Physics Institute, where the body the plasmoid part from its body. So this is the plasmoid part and this is the body. Okay, so when Malcolm Bendall talks about plasmoids all the time, I'm more interested in this bit. He says plasmoids aren't, you could argue that these two things together are plasmoids, but like this is the magnetoelectrical radiation, and this would be the magnetoelectrical cluster. Without this being in here, you've just got a load of ions traveling around, and this is basically a whole bunch of ions that still, this might actually create another one of these if it got energized a little bit more, but maybe not. But this for me, the electromagnetic phantom, the vacuum current structure, that what they suggest is maybe a toroid of background neutrinos, either from the environment or from unidirectional discharge disruption of materials, ideally hydrogen being the easiest. This is the thing that can go through glass, and this being a sheet of a dielectric material here. Okay, so it is proven, and the other work that was proven, that was mentioned, was the formation of, where is it? Monopoles, and that the monopoles would come off they would aggregate on the pole of a magnet. This was suggested by one of the researchers, and that's actually been proven by Bogdanovich here, and I included the work, and I'll give all these links in the bibliography, or the references for this presentation. And it's just my machine's a bit slow, but mostly because it's Adobe Acrobat that's stupid slow. But in here it shows this discussion about the monopoles that were aggregated onto the pole of a magnet, but they're knocked off by the gamma rays and so on. And then I talked about various cases where cavitation researchers have had their careers destroyed by people in the US Navy or associated with the US Navy, whether that is here in the case of Teliarkin or the case of Leclerc, and that this guy is essentially the safety guy. And what did I find out? He was nominated to Fred Zopfel was nominated to be a member of the U.S. Nuclear Safety Research Review Committee in 1990. Okay, and this guy pops up out of the blue a few months before the release of Robert Temple's book, and gives this saying, basically, if you're mentioning Leclerc's work, who did research at the U.S. Naval Labs, and then basically you're basically an idiot, and you should be ignored too. So very nice, but he's famous for doing this sort of thing. It was just the first. It was weird that I'm thinking that Robert Murray Smith was put up to do those two videos by the US Navy through some circuitous route through the Department of Energy or whatever. And the person that comes and does the hit job on me is a nuclear researcher from the US Navy, who's supposedly part of the US Nuclear Safety Research Review Committee, right? And it's like, I rest my case. Okay. So that's about it, really, for me tonight. I'll see if you've got any questions that I can pick up quickly. If not, then I will call it a night, because I have to be somewhere else in about 20 minutes. Felix says, so cavitation is bad. No, cavitation has been shown to be able to remediate nuclear waste. So, because the actual structure doesn't like to produce radioactive material unless you push it too hard. Like, if you have a resonant structure, it builds and it builds and it builds and it builds and it builds. The idea is to stop it building. So you kind of like want to take breaks and let it settle, and then maybe start it off again, right? So like, that's why I think it's nice, the gentle structure of the vibration of
Dr. Roy Shinamaza. Because as it's going up and down, you've got the cavitation nodes, but because you've got fins above each other like this, right? But also you've got a flow going through this way, so it's constantly cleaning it away. So it's not like what happened with Leclerc. He had these holes in this aluminium material, 2 different size holes, and then he rolled it into a Swiss roll. So the resonant areas were in the same place all of the time. So you're adding and adding and adding an energy. If you're putting more ions into this coherent matter phase singularity, and you're adding more energy. So it's not surprising that you end up by getting a wide range of elements. Okay, so thank you very much for your time, guys. Please reach out via remoteview.icu if you've got any outstanding questions or you want something clarified. This has been a pleasure to share the intriguing information and the intrigue this 28th of January 2024. I wish you a wonderful February in this leap year and good fortune. Thank you very, very much for your time. Buenas noches, dobranoc, good night.